side of my money, please. There we go. Part of what we're going to talk about tonight is money, specifically counterfeiting. Anyway, Smead Road. Y'all know where Smead Road is? Just a little ways up from Lower Podunk. And on Smead Road is one of the 6 cemeteries that are in Wardsboro. And I was up there this week, and I was moseying around looking for the grave of Joseph White. He is buried up there. He died in 1805. He was a direct Mayflower descendant, by the way. And his wife, her name was Deborah, and her maiden name was Fish. And also buried in that cemetery, according to the records, is their daughter, Abigail White. Now, Abigail eventually got married. She married a man named Job Ramsdell. The Ramsdells had owned a sawmill, big lumber business, later a cider mill as well. And Job and Abigail went on to have 12 children in all. Abigail died at about 64 years of age. Job lived to like 91, and that's crazy old for, especially for Abigail. Most women in their childbearing years didn't have that long of a life expectancy, half that. Anyway, just pull that little bit of information in your head again about the Whites and specifically Abigail, and we'll come back to her a little bit later on. Oh, by the way, just to make a note, everything I am talking about tonight took place before Wardsboro was 30 years old. So this is all first and second generation stuff. So, let's talk for a few minutes about paper money. In colonial times, every one of the colonies printed their own money. And then after 1776, all the states printed their own money. Now think about this for a minute. How would you know that your money from Massachusetts, say, was the equal value of my money from Vermont? You would have no way of knowing. To make matters even worse, you wouldn't even know if the money from Massachusetts was real. And you wouldn't know if the money from Vermont was real either. We're going to get into counterfeiting in a little bit more detail. Now, one of the reasons that people didn't use a lot of money, first of all, coinage was scarce, the paper money was iffy, and so people stuck to barter for a very long time. For most of the 1800s, barter was still very popular because I knew that I could go into the general store, say with a barrel of turnips, and trade that for, say, a bolt of cloth to stitch up some long johns for the winter. Barter was safer all the way around rather than accepting paper money. Paper money in the 1800s, early 1800s was just too risky. Now, what was Vermont's best paper money? Well, Vermont's best paper money came out at about 1806 with the founding of the Vermont State Bank. It was founded in Windsor, but it opened in Woodstock, which was a bigger trading hub at the time. And soon there were branch banks of the Vermont State Bank everywhere. Burlington, Middlebury, Bradford, Bellows Falls had one, and every single one of those banks printed their own paper money with their name on it. Now, one more thing to keep in mind. This was all before there was an official United States currency. We were the United States, but we didn't have United States currency yet. Now, with so much unfamiliar paper money running around, you would really have no way of knowing what was real, what was legit. It was just impossible to know. And within the first, say, 20 years, between like, say, 1806 and maybe 1825, 1 out of every 10 paper money bills was counterfeit. 1 out of 10. Once you start printing paper money, the counterfeiters all show up immediately, like an hour later. They're all there printing money. Now, the kind of paper that the banknotes was printed on was like tissue paper. It was the cheapest, very flimsiest, cheapest stuff. And it was even easier for people to print fake bills because the back of the money was blank. And so the forgers, they only had to print one side of the money. They did not have to print the other side. Now, the best that the authorities could do against the counterfeiters was to impose dire consequences for counterfeiting. And there was a while in Vermont when death was one of the options to be imposed as a penalty. That was actually revoked in 1797, and as far as I can tell, nobody in Vermont was ever executed for counterfeiting. That I found out anyway. There could have been, but I didn't research that deep. Now, in the early days of Vermont, counterfeiters were typically sentenced to being whipped or pilloried, I've been practicing that word, in addition to jail terms, fines, and forfeiture of their property. It was bad. Early on, Vermont did away with the hanging, and then very soon after that, like by 1807, they did away with whipping and pillorying as well, because they built a brand new state prison up in Windsor. It opened in 1809, and just a little note, when the prison opened, half of the convicts in there were counterfeiters, just to give you an idea. Anyway, so now we have to come back to Abigail White. Before I tell this part of the story, though, I have a little plot twist. I am not sure that the Abigail White from Wardsboro is the Abigail White that this story is about. I think you'll see that there are a lot of Abigail Whites. But this is the story that's been going around. Abigail White of Wardsboro whipped for counterfeiting. And time after time, it's repeated and repeated and repeated. Abigail White from Wardsboro. Now, there is this book called The History of Newfane, the First Century, and I'm going to read to you from page 32 of this book, and this is where the whole thing of Abigail White from Wardsboro started. So this was written by Charles Kellogg Field. He was a lawyer in Newfane, and when they published that centennial publication, they asked him to write a little recollection. Maybe they had a Founders Day, just like us. And Charles Kellogg Field talked about the whipping post, and this is what he wrote. Now, he was 70 years old when he wrote this, but what he's writing about is his memory from when he was 4 years old. Quote, oh, also, by the way, this was before Newfane moved down the hill. Remember, Newfane started up on the top of the hill. Okay, Charles Kellogg Field writes, at an early day, corporal punishments were inflicted at every turn of the court on Newfane Hill. The writer of this sketch, a mere boy, well remembers witnessing the whipping of Mother White of Wardsboro. So about Abigail. In 1807, August, she was convicted of passing counterfeit money and sentenced to receive 39 lashes upon her bare back. A great crowd of men and women collected to witness the whipping. The post was in the form of a cross with a transverse strip near the top, to which her bare arms were bound, and her body was stripped to the waist. The high sheriff applied a certain number of stripes, and the balance were allotted to his deputies, some 7 in number, and some of whom applied the blows with great vigor. Near the close of the whipping, her back became raw, and she suffered excessive pain, and she shrieked and screamed terribly in her agony. Now, Charles Kellogg Fields ends his little story with this. The writer of this sketch, although very young, remembers this scene distinctly. The meeting house and academy stood a few rods above the side of the whipping post, and their windows were filled with women gazing intently upon the revolting scene. He writes, this was probably the last woman publicly whipped in Vermont, for the legislature abolished the whipping post that fall and provided for the building of the state prison. And that's the end of Charles Kellogg Field's story. Now, going back to when this whipping actually happened, the time when Charles Kellogg Field was 4 years old, I ran across this record. And it's totally different, sort of. This one says, during the session of the Supreme Court at Newfane, which this day closed, Abigail White, a woman of about 40 years of age, from the province of Canada, was convicted of passing counterfeit bank bills and was sentenced by the court to be whipped, 39 stripes, to be fined, and to pay the cost of prosecution. This day, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. If you were sentenced in court that morning, you got whipped by the end of the day. On this day, 5 o'clock afternoon, she received the corporal part of her punishment at the public whipping post in this town. She now stands committed until the other part be complied with. Now, what was the other part? Obviously, she hadn't paid her fines and the court costs, so she was probably going back to jail after the whipping. She wasn't going home to tend her wounds. But notice that that account, written about 1807, says it was Abigail White from Lower Canada, not Abigail White from Wardsboro. Now, there's another source, yet another source, and this very, very bad Abigail White was probably part of a gang. There was a gang of counterfeiters out of Keene, New Hampshire called the Trask Gang, and they were passing counterfeit goods in Vermont too. And to make matters worse, there were actually 2 Abigail Whites who were in the Trask Gang out of New Hampshire, not Wardsboro. Then there is this from a different account of the same era. Quote, Abigail White of Wyndham went to trial. She was sentenced to whipping and a fine for passing counterfeit bills. She is believed to be the last woman whipped by state law. Notice that it says Wyndham, Abigail White of Wyndham, not Abigail White of Wardsboro. Now, somehow this bad Abigail White must have gotten herself in trouble again, because a year later, either that or she was still in jail, like maybe she still hadn't paid the court costs and she was still in jail. But I ran across a little newspaper clipping about Abigail White because she was still in jail. And also, by the way, this is not the jail where the new museum is now. This is the jail that used to be whatever it was up on the hill when the town was still on the hill. So this is the little newspaper clipping. $5 reward. That would be like maybe $130 today. Strayed from the jail in Newfane on the night of the 30th, September 30th, 1808. A woman by the name of Abigail White. She was about 6 feet high, very straight, and very pleasing in her conversation and manners. Light complexion. She was very genteelly dressed. The last time she was seen in the custody of the jailer, like, did he take her out to dinner or something? I've been wondering about that part. When she travels, she commonly wears lace boots. The above reward will be paid upon the delivery of said Abigail White to the Newfane jail. Signed, Zatter Butterfield, jailer, Newfane. So here's what I've been thinking. We got a lot of Abigail White, some from New Hampshire, some from Wyndham, some from Canada. So it's easy to see how the bad Abigail White, the one who was whipped, the one who later escaped from jail, who everyone for the last couple of 100 years, just because of what Charles Kellogg Field wrote in this book, the bad Abigail White is not our Abigail White from Wardsboro. It's not Abigail White Ramsdell, who you all now know lies peacefully in her grave up on Smead Road. So here's what I'm thinking. I am imagining that the bad Abigail White, the notorious counterfeiter, the jailbreaker, maybe had some kind of a hideout in Wardsboro when she was passing bad money. Or maybe when she escaped from jail, somebody in Wardsboro was hiding her. And on that day, when the sheriffs and the deputies finally caught her and caught up with her and arrested her again, she might have been in Wardsboro. And so it got written in stone from that point on that she was from Wardsboro. And that's what the legal and historical record somehow got written down, that she was in or from Wardsboro. And that's where Charles Kellogg Field got it. Or else there is another possibility, and that is that somebody just made a mistake. That somewhere in transcribing the records, the words Wyndham or Canada or something got transposed into Wardsboro. That's also a possibility. And there's one more idea I had. That the 70-year-old Charles Kellogg Field, that's him right there, just never fact-checked what he wrote. He sent his little story. He sent his little story to the book. He was a distinguished lawyer and justice of the peace, had served in the state legislature, very distinguished fellow from an honorable family. Nobody fact-checked his work. And so for the last couple of 100 years, it's always been Abigail White from Wardsboro. So, now that we've figured out all these different Abigail Whites, we've done a little who's who of Abigail Whites, maybe we ought to try to clear her name so that we make sure from now on nobody calls her Abigail White from Wardsboro, whoever she was. And we also ought to try to clear the good name of our town and its law-abiding citizens. I don't think we are a hotbed of counterfeiters. Thank you.